This is the third screencast for Chapter 3, and it focuses on biogeochemical cycles. In other words, how matter cycles through various ecosystems and between ecosystems, some of the time being in bio or biological material, living material, sometimes being in geological material, rock, soil, and sometimes being in smaller units such as chemicals. So it moves through all three, and it cycles through each three. So we're going to look at the main biogeochemical cycles and briefly describe how they work, but mainly the point of understanding how these cycles work is to understand how human beings have impacted these cycles, maybe making some occur more, some taking away from others. So we're looking at the movement of matter within and between ecosystems, which involve biological, geological, and chemical processes. Now there are a lot of matter cycles here. The main ones we're going to focus on are carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and what is not shown here, which is water. And we'll look at some of the important elements known as macronutrients, but we're not really going to spend much time on that. So we'll start with the water cycle, more properly called the hydrologic cycle. And I'm sure you've been familiar with this for many, many years, but the sun's energy heats the earth and causes evaporation. Also, there's evaporation from land and there's evaporation from oceans, both that go up into the atmosphere and form clouds. There's also, in addition to evaporation from land and from water, there is a particular type of evaporation called evapotranspiration, which is from plants releasing water as a result of photosynthesis. And so all of that goes and becomes atmospheric water, which eventually returns to the earth as precipitation, rain, snow, hail, that type of thing. And then when the precipitation reaches the earth, certain things can happen. Mainly, one thing that can happen is that water infiltrates the soil. So it's taken up by plants and runs into the soil, eventually forming a very important thing to us, which we'll talk about later, which is groundwater. Lots of water in the ground from which plants, and eventually, as it goes deeper in the ground, humans can extract water. Another thing that can happen when precipitation reaches the ground is that there can be runoff. And runoff happens when either there are paved surfaces, so therefore the water can't infiltrate the soil, or when there aren't enough plants, when there has been deforestation, for example, and then surface runoff can increase, particularly in mountain regions, and you end up with tremendous mudslides and things like we looked at with Haiti. And what I really want to talk about, though, here is how we impact these water cycles. So it would be ideal if you could take a few minutes to try to think on your own how these, how human activities impact the hydrologic cycle. One example that I mentioned is deforestation. Another example that I've already mentioned is paving for cities and towns and so forth. And so these impact the water cycle. So see if you can think of a few others. So one of the main ways that humans have impacted the water cycle is by clearing land for agriculture. And that land, as you saw in a previous slide, is not as productive and doesn't even hold the soil as well as the pre-existing landscape did. In addition, for agriculture, we withdraw tremendous amounts of water for irrigation, which has improved the productivity of agriculture. But at a rate, if we withdraw the groundwater at a faster rate than it can be replenished, which we do, then it becomes problematic. A second major way that we impact water is by polluting it. We pollute it in various ways, sometimes with waste, sometimes with heat, sometimes with sediment, and those will all be looked at. We'll spend an entire week talking about water and water pollution, but that is another major impact that humans have on water. A third major impact is blocking the flow or changing the flow of water. So we often put up dams that go across rivers, and that holds back the water, creates a reservoir behind it, which is going to change that ecosystem that previously existed and decrease the amount of water downstream. So again, that's something we will look at and spend about a week talking about with water as well. And in addition to blocking waterways, we also divert water. We build aqueducts, which carry water, for example, from a lake to a city such as Los Angeles, which we've looked at as a case study. So the major impacts are through water diversion, which could include dams, through water pollution, and from surface paving, which causes more runoff, and from agriculture, which uses tremendous amount of water from groundwater, and also the land is not as efficiently productive. And also, one thing I haven't mentioned is industry. Industry, such as electricity generation, often occurs along bodies of water because they can use that water for cooling systems. So agriculture and industry both have a major role here in impacting water. The water cycle. Oh, last, what I should have pointed out, and I don't like about these diagrams, is that everything is numbered. A cycle is exactly that, a cycle. So you could start anywhere. We could start with precipitation, for example. So while it's useful to walk you through the steps by looking at numbers, it really is a cycle. Okay, we have mentioned all of these, but let's just make sure we have the terms down. Transpiration is the process where plants release water from their leaves into the atmosphere. I'm actually glad that this slide came up because I did leave out one important impact on the hydrologic cycle, and that's deforestation. When we take out those trees which produce water, release water from those leaves, we are again impacting the water cycle. We're making it the atmosphere less watery, less humid, for example, and that affects the hydrologic cycle as well. Okay, so evapotranspiration is the combination of the evaporation and transpiration. Fun fact, if you want to demonstrate it for yourself, you can put a piece of celery in some food-colored water, and you can watch the food coloring go up the xylem of the celery, up the stem, in through the leaves. And if you put a plastic baggie, like a lunch bag, sandwich bag, over top of the leaves of the celery, you will see little red droplets, if you used red, whatever color food coloring you use, little red droplets coming out and forming on the plastic bag. Okay, and third important term just to keep in mind is runoff, and that's when water moves across the land surface into streams and rivers, eventually would reach the ocean. However, runoff is typically not something that you want to increase the amount of. Okay, I'm going to pause here and do the carbon cycle separately.